"Stop! I'll buy the obese girl." That's what the giant cowboy shouted on a freezing afternoon in Dry Creek, stopping the jeers, the bidding, and the bottle of whiskey that was about to trade for her life. Folks thought he was buying trouble, and maybe he was, but trouble follows mercy like a shadow. Out on the snowbound trail, the wind cuts like a knife, and the girl wonders if she's just stepped from one prison into another. The giant cowboy says nothing yet in his silence. There's a promise that will be tested when the railroad men come with paper and law on their side, fire in the night. Behind those lamplight windows, secrets smolder about the land, the treaties, and bloodlines no one talks about. By the time the church bell tolls again, the girl will have to decide if she's worth fighting for, and the cowboy will have to prove that family is more than blood. Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments. Share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. The winter wind whistled between the buildings of Dry Creek, carrying stinging flecks of snow that bit at exposed skin. Lottie Ransom hunched her shoulders, trying to make herself smaller as jeers and cruel laughter echoed around her. The rough wooden planks of the makeshift auction block pressed cold against her feet through worn boot soles. Her father swayed. Below, waving a jug of whiskey. His face was flushed red. Whether from drink or the bitter wind, she couldn't tell anymore. "Who'll give me fair trade for her?" he called out, voice slurring. "Strong back, good worker." Lottie kept her eyes fixed on a knot in the wooden platform. She'd learned young that meeting people's stares only made things worse. The crowd outside the saloon grew, drawing more onlookers to her shame. Some traders passing through town had stopped to watch, their wagon wheels creaking to a halt in the snow-dusted street. "Ain't worth more than that jug he's holding," someone called out, triggering fresh laughter. Tears pricked at Lottie's eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall. The wind cut through her thin dress, making her shiver. She'd known this day would come. Eventually, her father had threatened it often enough when the drink was in him. Still, the reality of being put up for sale like cattle cut deep to bits. Another voice shouted mockingly, "That's generous for such a big one." Her father's answering laugh was ugly. "Come now, surely she's worth more than stop." The single word cut through the laughter like a knife. Deep and commanding, it drew every eye to the far edge of the boardwalk. Lottie couldn't help looking up herself. A tall figure stood there, broad-shouldered in a worn sheepskin coat. Snow dusted his dark hat, and his stance was solid as oak. Even from a distance, his presence commanded attention. "I'll buy the girl," he said, striding forward. The crowd parted before him like water. Lottie recognized him now. Caleb Holt, who ran the big ranch north of town. She'd seen him sometimes at the general store, always polite, always paying his bills prompt and fair. The other townsfolk respected him, though some whispered about his mixed blood and strange ways. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. With deliberate movements, he counted $5 gold into her father's palm. Coins gleamed in the winter light. Gasps rippled through the crowd. It was a fortune compared to the jeering bids before, enough to buy good, horseflesh, or a winter's worth of supplies. Her father's fingers closed greedily around the coins. "Sold, then," he declared with a laugh that made Lottie's stomach turn. But Caleb wasn't laughing. His movements were gentle as he stepped onto the platform and offered Lottie his hand. "Come down careful now," he said softly, just for her ears. The wood slick with snow. His grip was warm and steady as he helped her down. Without a word, he shrugged off his sheepskin coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth of it nearly brought fresh tears to her eyes. Not from cold this time, but from the simple kindness of it. "Now see here," Caleb said, his voice carrying clearly down the street. "This girl is no one's property. She's a free person, same as any of us." He turned toward the sheriff's office, and Lottie followed close behind him, clutching the coat around herself. The crowd trailed after them, murmuring, eager to see what would happen next. Sheriff Wade was warming his boots by the pot-belly stove when they entered, looked up lazily at the procession filing in behind them. "What's all this, then?" To establish something clear, Caleb said, "This here's Lottie Ransom. I've just prevented her being sold like livestock in the street. Want to make sure everyone understands she's free to make her own choices from here on." The sheriff scratched, his chin looking between them. "Well now, ain't no law against a man selling his own kin in these parts. Happens sometimes with them as can't provide. Transaction's legal enough, far as I'm concerned." "That ain't the point," Caleb said firmly. "I'm not buying ownership. I'm buying her freedom." The sheriff shrugged. "Makes no difference to me how. You want to reckon it. Paper's paper, gold's gold." Lottie kept silent through it all, warmth slowly returning to her limbs inside the heavy coat. She watched Caleb from the corner of her eye, still not quite believing what was happening. No one had ever stood up for her before when they left the sheriff's office. The crowd had thinned, though plenty of eyes still watched from windows and doorways. Caleb led the way to where his sorrel gelding stood patiently at the hitching post, steam rising from its flanks in the cold air. "Can you ride?" he asked quietly. Lottie nodded. She'd learned young like most frontier children. Good. He cupped his hands to give her a boost up, then adjusted the stirrups for her. The horse shifted beneath her, but stayed steady. By the time they reached the edge of town, night was starting to fall. Lanterns flickered behind frosted windows, casting warm squares of light onto the snowy street. Lottie looked back once at the only home she'd ever known, then faced forward, holding tight to the saddle horn as they rode into the gathering dusk. The sound of hoofbeats and snow followed them out of Dry Creek, steady and sure as a heartbeat. Above them, the first stars were beginning to shine in the winter sky, clear and bright as new-minted coins. The sorrel's hooves crunched through the crusty snow as they left Dry Creek behind. Each step echoed in the stillness of the winter night. Marking their slow progress along the frozen creek road, Lottie huddled deeper into Caleb's sheepskin coat, but the cold still found ways to reach her. The worn dress beneath offered little protection against the bitter wind that whistled down from the mountains. Moonlight spilled across the landscape, turning the ice-locked creek into a silver ribbon that wound through the darkness. Their breath formed clouds in the frigid air, mixing with the steam that rose from the horse's flanks. The familiar silhouette of Dry Creek's water tower grew smaller and smaller behind them until it vanished completely in the darkness. Caleb walked beside, the horse, one hand resting lightly on the reins. He spoke little, seeming to sense Lottie's need for quiet after the day's ordeal. When he did break the silence, his words were practical, meant to comfort rather than pry. "Not much further to the line shack," he said, his voice barely carrying above the whisper of wind through bare branches. "We'll rest there till morning." Lottie nodded, though she doubted he could see the gesture in the darkness. Her muscles had grown stiff from cold in the unfamiliar position in the saddle. Every step of the horse sent aches through her tired body. By midnight, they reached a small structure tucked against a stand of pine trees. The line shack was rough-hewn but solid, built to shelter cowboys working the far reaches of ranch land. Caleb helped her down from the saddle, her legs nearly buckling as they touched the ground. Inside, he worked quickly to bring the space to life. The tiny pot-bellied stove soon glowed with welcome heat, and the familiar smell of coffee filled the cramped interior. Lottie sat on a narrow bench, still wrapped in his coat, watching as he moved with practiced efficiency in the small space. When he handed her a tin cup of steaming coffee, she took it with trembling hands. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time she'd spoken since leaving town. Caleb nodded, settling onto a wooden crate across from her. The lantern light caught the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, casting shadows across his weathered face, though he'd shown nothing but kindness. Lottie couldn't shake the feeling that she'd merely traded one form of captivity for another. She'd heard too many stories of girls in similar situations, their rescues leading to something worse. They passed the rest of the night in silence, broken only by the pop and crackle of the fire in the stove. Lottie dozed fitfully on the narrow bunk, while Caleb kept watch from his seat by the door. Dawn arrived with a pale golden light that filtered through the shack's single window. After a breakfast of hardtack softened in coffee, they set out again. The horse plowed through deeper drifts as they left the creek road. heading toward the distant dark line of timber that marked the edge of Caleb's ranch. Around midday, they passed an abandoned cabin set back from the trail. Its roof had partially caved in under the weight of previous snows, and the door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Lottie studied it as they rode past, noting how quickly a home could fall to ruin once its people were gone. The short winter day was drawing to a close when they finally... Inside the house was plain but well kept. Caleb led her up a narrow staircase to the second floor, stopping at a small bedroom that faced east over the valley. "This can be your room," he said, lighting the lamp on the bedside table. "There's extra blankets in the chest if you need them." The room was simple: a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a rocking chair by the window, but to Lottie's eyes, it seemed like luxury after years of sleeping on a pallet in her father's cabin. They shared a quiet supper of beans and cornbread. In the kitchen below, the only sounds were the clink of spoons against bowls and the constant howl of wind around the eaves. Lottie ate sparingly, though her stomach cramped with hunger. Years of habit made her wary of taking too much. Later, as she lay in her new bed, listening to the winter storm rage outside, she heard Caleb's voice through the thin wall that separated their rooms. He was praying, his words too soft to make out clearly, but the gentle rhythm of them carried through the darkness. There was something in that quiet devotion that eased some of the tension in her chest. For the first time since leaving Dry Creek, Lottie allowed herself to consider that perhaps Caleb's kindness came without hidden cost. The thought was foreign, enough to make her uncomfortable, but it settled in her mind like a seed waiting for spring. Morning broke over the ranch in a dazzling display of winter sunshine. Frost crystals glittered on every surface, turning ordinary fence posts and bare branches into works of art. The cold air bit sharp and clean, carrying the familiar scents of pine and wood smoke. Caleb found Lottie already awake, standing uncertainly. In the kitchen, she'd managed to start the coffee pot on her own, though her hands twisted nervously in her apron as he entered. "Time you learned your way around," he said, pouring them each a cup. "Bundle up good ites, bitter out there." They started with the barn, its massive doors creaking as Caleb pulled them open. Inside, the familiar smells of hay and horse greeted them. Lanterns hung from posts cast pools of golden light in the shadows. "Morning feed's already done," Caleb explained, nodding toward where two ranch hands worked. "That there's Bert Hanley been with the ranch longer than me. And the young fellow's Joe Merrick, came on last spring." Bert, gruff but kind-eyed, touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," his weathered face creased in a gentle smile that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. Joe, younger and eager, gave a friendly wave as he forked hay into a stall. Both men's eyes held questions, but their manners kept them from prying. Still, Lottie shrank slightly under their gazes. Pulling Caleb's borrowed coat tighter around her shoulders, they moved on to the chicken coop, where speckled hens pecked at scattered feed. "Eggs need gathering twice daily," Caleb said, demonstrating how to check the nesting boxes. "Watch for the red henshies prone to pecking." In the corrals, two mustangs stamped restlessly, their winter coats shaggy against the cold. Their breath came in great white plumes as they tossed their heads, studying the newcomer. Snow lay deep around the fence posts, unmarked except for animal tracks. Back at the house, Caleb showed her where to find the broom and other cleaning supplies. "Start with what you know," he said kindly, sweeping the porch, gathering eggs simple things. "No need to rush into anything else." Lottie nodded, relief visible in her shoulders at these manageable tasks. She set to work while Caleb headed out to check fence lines with Joe. The day passed slowly, marked by the sun's arc across the crystal-clear sky. Lottie moved through her assigned chores with careful attention, though her movements suggested she expected criticism at any moment. Evening brought everyone back to the house, drawn by the warmth and the promise of supper. After the meal, Caleb pulled on his coat. Heading out for a final check of the barn, he was nearly to the door when he heard a soft voice coming from behind the hay bales. Lottie's voice trembling and raw with emotion, realizing she was praying. "Lord," she whispered, "I know I ain't worth much. I'm sorry for being so ugly and useless. Her words caught on a sob. Please help me not be such a burden here. I don't want to shame Mr. Holt's kindness. The naked self-loathing in her voice struck Caleb like a physical blow. His hands clenched at his sides, anger rising not at her, but at those who had ground her spirit so low. He backed away silently, not wanting to shame her further by revealing he'd overheard. That night, sleep was long in coming, as her words echoed in his mind. By morning, he'd made a decision. The sun had barely cleared the mountains when he found Lottie in the kitchen. Joe's mending fence wire in the south pasture, he said, keeping his voice gentle. Thought you might help him today, if you're willing. She looked startled at the suggestion, but nodded. Caleb noticed she stood a little straighter, as if pleased. To be trusted with real ranch work, the morning was cold enough to freeze breath midair. Joe waited by the tool shed, extra wire coiled over his shoulder. He grinned when Lottie approached, clearly glad for the company. Careful of the drifts. Caleb called after them as they set out. He watched them go, two dark figures against the endless white of the snow-covered pasture. Throughout the day he found reasons to ride past, checking their progress. The work was slow. The snow indeed proved treacherous in places, but steady. Once, he saw Lottie pause in her work, face turned skyward. A red-tailed hawk wheeled overhead, its cry piercing the winter silence. A faint smile touched her lips as she watched it soar, the expression transforming her face into something almost beautiful. Dusk arrived early, as it always did in winter. The smell of Bert's famous beef stew drew everyone inside, where lamplight cast warm shadows on the walls. They gathered around the scarred kitchen table. Passing cornbread and swapping stories of the day's work, Caleb found himself telling a story about his mother, remembering how she'd once chased a bear from her garden armed with nothing but a wooden spoon and sheer determination. That old bear hightailed it through the creek, said, grinning at the memory, looking like the devil himself was after him. Mama stood there shaking that spoon and telling him exactly what she thought about berry thieves. A sound stopped. Him mid-sentence Lottie's laugh, small and rusty from disuse, but real. She covered her mouth quickly, as if surprised by her own amusement. But her eyes held a spark of life he hadn't seen before. The sound of that laugh stayed with him long after the dishes were cleared in the house. Had settled into nighttime silence. It was a beginning, he thought, small as a mustard seed, holding all the promise of spring. 3 days passed like whispers across the snow-covered ranch. The morning air held the sharp bite of deep winter as Lottie made her way to the chicken coop, feed bucket swinging from her mittened hand. Fresh snow crunched beneath her boots, marking her path across the yard. The speckled hens clucked and fussed around her feet as she scattered feed. Their feathers puffed against the cold. She'd learned their personalities, now the bossy red hen, the gentle brown one that let her stroke its back. Small victories, but they made her smile. A horse's whinny caught her attention. Through gaps in the weathered boards, she spotted a rider approaching the ranch house. Snow might blanket the ground, but dust still clung to the stranger's coat and hat. Speaking of a long journey, Caleb emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. The stranger dismounted, removing his hat, a gesture that revealed a clean-shaven face and city clothes beneath the trail dirt. A surveyor's scope hung at his saddle. Mr. Holt. The man's voice carried clearly in the still air, representative of the Western Pacific Railroad Company. He reached into his satchel, producing an envelope sealed with red wax. Lottie's hands stilled on the feed bucket. She'd seen enough official papers in her life to recognize trouble when it arrived. Sealed and stamped, Caleb broke the seal, unfolding the document. His expression remained steady, but something in his shoulders tightened as he read. The surveyor mounted up, apparently having delivered his message, and rode away without another word. Unable to contain her worry, Lottie edged closer to the house. Through the kitchen window, she could see Caleb at the table, still studying the paper. His face had grown grave. "Legal writ," he said without looking up, somehow sensing her presence in the doorway. "Railroad claims this land's under disputes. There's question about the old Ute Treaty boundaries." He laid the paper flat, running a hand through his hair. "They want it for a water stop on their new line." Fear clutched at Lottie's chest. In her short time here, the ranch had become more than shelter. It was the first place she'd felt safe. Now it might be taken away, and worse, she felt responsible. Hadn't trouble followed her all her life? The day crawled by, heavy with unspoken worry. As they sat down to supper, Lottie barely touched her food. The lamplight cast long shadows across the table as she gathered her courage. "Mr. Holt," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "I could go back ... to my father. Save you the extra mouth to feed while you're dealing with this trouble."
Oh.
Caleb's fork clattered against his plate. "No." The word came sharp and quick, followed by a softer tone. "Family. Don't quit family, Lottie. Whatever comes, we face it together." She stared at him, struck by the word family. He met her gaze steadily, and she saw nothing but truth there. "First light tomorrow," he continued. "We'll hitch up the wagon and ride into Dry Creek. County clerk might have answers about this treaty business." Morning brought steel-gray skies and bitter wind. Lottie sat beside Caleb on the wagon's seat, wrapped in every blanket they could spare. The journey to town passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the creak of harness leather and the steady clip of hooves. Dry Creek looked different in daylight, less threatening, though memories of that terrible night still made her shudder. They tied the horses outside the courthouse, a square brick building that seemed to frown at visitors. The county clerk's office smelled of dust and old paper. Behind a high desk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles examined the railroads. Rid his fingers, stained with ink, traced each line carefully. "This is troublesome, Mr. Holt," he said finally, looking up. "The dispute is real enough. These treaty boundaries were never properly surveyed." He shuffled through more papers, shaking his head. "Sorry, but I don't see an easy answer here." Caleb nodded as if he'd expected this. "Much obliged for looking," he said simply. Tucking the writ back into his coat, they stepped outside to find snow falling thick, heavy flakes that meant business. "Better head back," Caleb said, helping Lottie into the wagon. "Storm's coming." The return journey was slower, visibility dropping with each passing mile. By the time they reached the ranch, darkness had nearly fallen. Caleb lit the lamps while Lottie built up the fire. Their movements synchronized after days of sharing space. Later, Caleb sat at the kitchen table, the writ spread before him in the lamplight. His finger traced the railroad's proposed route, marked in harsh black lines across their land. Lottie settled in a chair nearby, working on mending a tear in her sleeve. The needle flashed silver in her hands as she made tiny, careful stitches. Looking up from her work, she studied Caleb's face. The lamp cast shadows beneath his eyes, highlighting the stern set of his jaw. But there was something else there too, a steadiness she hadn't noticed before. This was a man who planted his feet and stood his ground, wouldn't walk away when things got hard. The realization settled warm in her chest, pushing back the familiar fear of abandonment. Whatever came next, she wasn't alone anymore. 2 days after their visit to the county clerk, frost etched delicate patterns across the ranch house windows. Caleb saddled 2 horses before dawn, his sorrel gelding and a gentle bay mare for Lottie. The morning held the kind of bitter cold that made breathing hurt, but the sky promised clear weather for their ride. "We're heading to see an old friend," Caleb explained as he helped Lottie mount. She had improved at handling horses, though her movement still held uncertainty. "Henry Tall Elk runs the blacksmith shop over in the Ute settlement. If anyone knows about these treaty matters, it's him." They rode east as the sun climbed, their horses' breath forming clouds in the frozen air. The settlement appeared after 2 hours, a cluster of buildings where traditional lodges stood alongside wooden structures. Smoke rose from several chimneys. Carrying the sharp scent of pine, the blacksmith shop announced itself with a rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil. As they dismounted, a tall man emerged from the doorway, wiping his hands on a leather apron. His black hair showed touches of gray at the temples, and smile lines creased the corners of his eyes. "Caleb Holt," Henry called out, his voice warm. With recognition. "Been too long, brother." The men clasped hands firmly, and Henry's keen gaze took in Lottie's presence with gentle curiosity. "Miss Lottie Ransom," Caleb introduced her. "She's staying at the ranch now?" Henry nodded, his smile kind. "Welcome. Come in where it's warm. Coffee's hot." The shop's interior glowed with forge light, tools hanging in neat rows along the walls. A pot of coffee bubbled on a small stove in the corner. Henry poured 3 tin cups while Caleb pulled out the railroad's writ. "Thought you might make sense of this," Caleb said, spreading the paper on a workbench. "Railroads claiming treaty. Right." Henry studied the document, his expression thoughtful. The silence stretched, broken only by the occasional pop from the forge's coals. Lottie perched on a wooden stool, cradling her coffee cup for warmth, watching the two men. "There might be a way," Henry said finally. "The treaty has provisions for continuous family claim. Your mother's Ute blood could protect your right to the land if you can prove unbroken lineage." Caleb's brow furrowed. "How? Marriage to someone with Ute heritage would strengthen your claim considerably." Henry's words fell into another silence. "Several families in the settlement have daughters of marriageable age, good people who understand what's at stake." Lottie felt her chest tighten, though she couldn't say why. She focused on her coffee, pretending not to listen. "I made a promise once," Caleb said quietly, "to my mother. Said I'd only marry for love, not convenience." Henry nodded, respecting the weight of such a vow. "The railroad won't wait for love, brother. They're pushing their line through by spring thaw." He rolled up the writ carefully. "Think on it. The land's worth fighting for." The ride home felt longer, though the weather held fair. Caleb remained lost in thought, speaking little. Found herself watching him from the corner of her eye, noting the stern set of his jaw, the way his shoulders carried invisible weight. Late afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows when they returned. While Caleb tended to the horses, Lottie lingered uncertainly by the stove. Bert came in from the barn, stamping snow from his boots. "Might be time you learned to make cornbread," the old wrangler said gruffly, but his eyes held kindness. "God, my mother's recipe right here." He pulled a creased paper from his shirt pocket. Lottie's hands trembled slightly as she measured flour and cornmeal. Bert guided her through each step, showing her how to test the skillet's heat, how to pour the batter just so. The familiar tasks steadied her nerves. When the cornbread came out, golden brown and fragrant, surprise flickered across everyone's face, including her own. They gathered around the table as evening drew in, passing the warm bread, eating in. Comfortable, quiet, even Joe, the young drifter, managed a genuine "Thank you, Miss Lottie." After supper, while the men settled in the front room, Lottie stood by the window. Moonlight transformed the snow-covered yard into something ethereal, each drift glowing with pale blue shadows. Her reflection ghosted against the glass of plane. Heavy-set girl who brought trouble wherever she went. The thought rose unbidden. Was she worth all this? Worth Caleb possibly losing his land because he'd taken her in, instead of making a useful marriage alliance? In the kitchen doorway, Caleb paused, watching her reflection in the window glass. Something shifted in his expression. As he looked at her, something that might have answered her unspoken question, had she turned to see it. But she remained still, lost in her own thoughts. While he stood silent in the shadows, holding his answer in his heart, the grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking time as the moon climbed higher over the snowbound ranch. Tomorrow's troubles could wait until tomorrow. For now, there was warmth and bread made by caring hands. And the quiet certainty that none of them faced the future alone, winter settled into a steady rhythm at the ranch. Each day marked by the familiar tasks that kept life moving forward. Mornings began before dawn, with Caleb and the hands trudging through knee-deep snow to feed the stock. The animals' breath rose in steamy clouds as they crowded around the hay bales, their hooves pawing at the frozen ground. Lottie found her place in this daily dance, learning to judge how much feed each chicken needed, mastering the art of breaking ice in the water troughs. Afternoons stretched long but purposeful, mending harnesses in the barn's warmth, stacking cordwood by the house, or helping Bert repair tools in the cramped workshop where the old wrangler kept his collection of well-worn implements. On a particularly bitter afternoon, the sound of sleigh bells cut through the winter quiet. Lottie looked up from where she was sweeping snow off the porch to see a horse-drawn sleigh approaching. Henry Tall Elk at the reins. Beside him sat a native woman wrapped in thick blankets, her young son huddled close against her side. Caleb, emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his coat as the sleigh drew up to the house. "Henry, didn't expect to see you in this weather. Ran into some trouble on the road," Henry explained, helping the woman and child down. "This is Ayanna and her boy, Tahu. Some soldiers were giving them grief near Miller's Creek. Thought they'd be safer here for a spell." Ayanna's face was composed, but her arms stayed protective around her son's shoulders. Tahu, a boy of perhaps 8 years, pressed close to his mother's side, dark eyes taking in everything. "You're welcome to stay as long as needed," Caleb said firmly. "Lottie, could you show them inside? Get them warmed up? Get them warmed up?" Lottie hesitated, suddenly self-conscious, but nodded. She led them into the house's warmth, where the cook stove radiated heat. Ayanna settled Tahu near the fire, while Lottie fetched blankets and put on water for coffee. The boy's gaze wandered, the room landing on a worn Bible sitting on the sideboard. "What's that book?" he asked softly, his first words since arriving. "That's Caleb's Bible," Lottie answered. Would you like me to read some of it?" Tahu nodded, eyes brightening. With his mother's approving smile, Lottie retrieved the Bible and sat in the rocking chair near the fire. Her voice started quiet but grew stronger as she read tales of David and Goliath, of Daniel in the lion's den. Tahu leaned forward entranced. "Could you teach me to read?" he asked when she finished. "Please." Something warm bloomed in Lottie's chest at his eagerness. "I'd like that very much. Over the next several days, between regular chores, Lottie." And Tahu sat at the kitchen table with paper and pencil. She taught him to form letters, praising his careful attempts. Ayanna often watched them, her quiet presence supportive as her son struggled with difficult words. Caleb noticed the change in Lottie during these lessons. Her smile came more readily now, reaching her eyes. She walked straighter, as if some invisible burden had lightened. When Tahu successfully read his first complete sentence, her laugh of delight rang through the house. One evening, snow fell in thick curtains outside. They gathered around the table for a meal of venison stew. The kitchen was warm and bright, filled with the comfortable sounds of spoons against bowls and quiet conversation. Bert had outdone himself with the stew, and even Joe, usually restless, seemed content. "The railroad men were near my late husband's land yesterday," Ayanna said suddenly, her voice soft but clear, measuring, making marks on trees. She stirred her stew, eyes distant. "My husband died protecting that land from them. He believed the treaties would hold." A heavy silence fell. Caleb set down his spoon, his expression grave. "How close were they to your property?" "Less than a mile. They carry papers, they say. Give them right of way." Ayanna's hand found Toe's shoulder. "They talk of a water stop, tracks through the heart of our grazing land." Henry, who had stayed for supper, exchanged a meaningful look with Caleb. The railroad's push was growing bolder, moving faster than anyone had expected. After the meal, while the others drifted off to their evening tasks, Lottie remained by the fire. She watched the flames dance, thinking about the strange turns life could take. A month ago, she'd been her father's unwanted burden, worth only the price of a whiskey jug. Now she sat in a warm kitchen where a little boy's eyes lit up at the sight of her, where her cornbread earned genuine praise, where her presence seemed to add something instead of taking away. The firelight painted the room in soft gold, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lottie felt the tender shoots of belonging taking root in her heart. She picked up Caleb's Bible, running her fingers over its worn leather cover, smiled as she thought of tomorrow's lesson with Tahu. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the ranch house, warmth and purpose had found their way too. A girl who'd never dared hope for either. A week of relative peace ended on a bitter morning when hoofbeats echoed across the frozen yard. Caleb looked up from mending harness to see a well-dressed man riding toward the house on a gleaming bay horse. The stranger's coat was too fine for ranch work, his boots too clean for the trail. "Mr. Holt?" The man's voice carried a practiced smoothness as he dismounted. "Name's Grayson, representing the railroad." He removed his leather gloves, revealing manicured hands that had never seen a day's hard labor. "Might we step inside? Got a business proposition that could benefit us both?" Caleb's jaw tightened, but he nodded, leading the way into the house. In the kitchen, Lottie was teaching Tahu his letters, while Ayana mended clothes by the window. They fell silent as the men entered. "Ladies," Grayson tipped his hat with practiced charm. "Young man, if you'll excuse us." Once alone in Caleb's study, Grayson settled into a chair without waiting for an invitation. He pulled an envelope from his coat. $2,000, Mr. Holt. Cash, all yours if you'll sign over the deed and clear out within the month. Caleb didn't even glance at the envelope. Not interested. Now, let's be reasonable. Grayson's smile never wavered. That's generous payment for land that's legally disputed. You could buy twice the acreage elsewhere, start fresh without any complications. His eyes drifted toward the kitchen where Iana and Tahu's voices could be heard. The answer's no. Caleb's voice was quiet, but firm as iron. This land's been in my family 3 generations. It's not for sale at any price. Grayson's smile thinned. He stood tucking the envelope away. The railroad always gets what it wants, Mr. Holt, one way or another. It's better to take the money than lose everything for nothing. He paused at the door. You've got people depending on you now? Might want to think about their welfare? Threat hung in the air like smoke as Grayson mounted up and rode away. Caleb watched until he disappeared into the trees, then went to check the barn and corrals. The afternoon passed tense and quiet. Everyone feeling the weight of Grayson's visit. As dusk approached, Lottie went to gather eggs from the henhouse. The winter air bit through her shawl as she crossed the yard. Movement caught her Aja familiar, figure skulking near the barn. Her heart stumbled as she recognized her father's stooped form. He emerged from the shadows. Looking thinner than she remembered, his eyes bloodshot. "Girl," he growled, "you're bringing trouble on these folks. Time to come home where you belong." Lottie's hands tightened on her egg basket. "This is my home now." "That railroad man came to see me," her father said. "Offered money if I'd take you back, get you clear of here. Said things might get rough otherwise." He took a stumbling step forward. "You're nothing but trouble, girl. Always have been. Don't drag these people down with you." Tears pricked at Lottie's eyes, but she held her ground. "No, Pa, I'm staying." She turned and walked steadily toward the house, though her legs trembled. As she mounted the porch steps, she heard the creak of floorboards. Caleb stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the gathering dark. He'd clearly witnessed the exchange, but chose not to intervene, letting her handle it herself. The knowledge that he trusted her to stand her ground made her stand a little straighter. "You all right?" he asked quietly as she passed. Lottie nodded, managing a small smile. "Yes, sir, I reckon I am." The next morning, Caleb gathered everyone in the kitchen after breakfast. "Keep your eyes open," he warned, his voice grave. "Railroad men play rough when they don't get their way. No one works alone outside. Bert Jocek. The fence is twice daily. Any sign of tampering? Reported immediately." Snow began falling as he spoke, thick flakes that quickly obscured the view through the windows. The world beyond the glass turned white and hazy, as if everything beyond the ranch house was being erased. In the warm kitchen, Lottie worked at the bread dough she'd set to rise earlier. Her hands moved steady and sure, kneading the soft mass with a rhythm that helped calm her racing thoughts. The familiar task anchored her as worry tried to take hold. Taff sat at the table nearby, carefully copying letters onto a slate. Ayana hummed softly as she stirred a pot of beans on the stove. The ordinary sounds of life continuing helped push back the fear that had crept in with Grayson's visit and her father's appearance. Through the frosted window, Lottie could see Caleb and the hands moving through the thickening snow, checking buildings and livestock. Their presence was reassuring, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting, like spring ice breaking up on the creek. Changes were coming, whether they were ready or not. She punched down the dough, with perhaps more force than necessary, and began shaping it into loaves. Her father's words echoed in her mind, nothing but trouble, but they held less power now. Here in this kitchen, with flour on her hands and the smell of baking bread in the air, she knew better. She wasn't nothing. She was someone who belonged. The snow fell harder outside, and Lottie found herself grateful for the storm. For a little while at least, it would keep the world at bay, giving them time to prepare for whatever came next. For days passed, intense vigilance. The snow finally eased, leaving behind a crystalline landscape under brilliant blue skies. Caleb stood at the window, adjusting his coat sleeve over his holster. Meetings at 2 o'clock. Reckon we should head out soon. I'm coming with you. Lottie's voice was firm as she pulled on her warmest shawl. Caleb turned, studying her face. Might get ugly in there. All the more reason you shouldn't face it alone. She met his gaze steadily, though her hands twisted in her shawl. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Reckon you're right. He helped her into the wagon, his movements careful and deliberate. The ride to town was quiet, their breath frosting in the cold air. Dry Creek looked different to Lottie now, less threatening, though the memories of that auction block still made her shiver. Several townsfolk nodded as they passed, a few even smiling at her. The town hall was already crowded when they arrived. Railroad men in fine coats stood at the front, Grayson among them. Whispers rippled through the room as Caleb and Lottie took seats near the middle. Bert and Joe had stayed behind to watch the ranch with Ayanna and Tahu. Mayor Thompson called the meeting to order, his round face grave. We're here to discuss the railroad's proposal for expansion through our territory. He nodded to Grayson. The floor is yours, sir. Grayson stepped forward, unfurling a map. Progress is coming, friends. The railroad means prosperity for everyone. His smile was practiced as he outlined grand plans for Dry Creek, becoming a major stop. Of course, he added smoothly, some sacrifices will be necessary. Some property owners will need to be ... reasonable. His gaze fixed on Caleb. Caleb rose slowly. The room fell silent. My family's worked that land for 3 generations, he said, his voice carrying to every corner. My mother was born there. Her mother before her. The creeks watered our stock through every drought. That soils fed us through every hard winter. He paused, looking around the room. Some things are worth more than money. The railroad's offer is more than generous, Grayson cut in. $2,000, it's not about the money. Caleb's quiet words silenced Grayson more effectively than a shout. It's about knowing what matters, what's right. Scattered applause broke out, growing stronger. Old man Jenkins stood up. Boy's right. Can't let them railroad men push us around. More voices joined in agreement, but others muttered darkly about progress being unstoppable. The meeting dissolved into heated arguments. Mayor Thompson finally called for order, declaring they'd reconvene in a week. Outside, several townspeople clapped Caleb on the shoulder as they passed. Even the sheriff nodded respectfully. Lottie felt a surge of pride as they climbed into the wagon for the ride home. The winter evening was crystal clear, stars burning bright overhead. Lottie found herself pointing out constellations she'd learned from Ayanna. Caleb listened, adding stories his mother had told him about the star patterns. They were still talking when they reached the ranch. The horses seemed eager for their warm stalls, and Lottie hurried to help unharness them. The night was peaceful, full of possibility. Hours later, shouts jolted Lottie from sleep. Orange light flickered through her window. For a moment she thought it was sunrise. Then she smelled smoke. Fire! Joe's voice cracked with panic. The barn's burning. Lottie ran outside in her nightdress, heart pounding. Flames roared through the barn's roof, painting the snow orange. Horses screamed inside. Caleb was already running toward the burning building. Get water. Save what you can. Boss, wait. Bert called, but Caleb had disappeared into the smoke. Lottie grabbed buckets, sobbing as she scooped snow. The heat was intense, melting the snow before she could throw it. She heard crashes inside the barn, then the thunder of hooves as horses bolted out. A terrible crack split the air. Part of the roof collapsed inward. Lottie screamed Caleb's name. Bert and Joe rushed forward as Caleb staggered out, leading the last horse. But something was wrong. He was hunched over, face twisted, in pain. A burning beam had caught his shoulder. The men helped him clear the barn just as more of the roof caved in. There was nothing to do but watch it burn. Lottie kept throwing snow at the edges of the fire, trying to keep it from spreading to other buildings, but her tears nearly blinded her. Dawn painted the sky pink through the smoke. Where the barn had stood, only charred timbers remained. The winter feed stored in the loft was destroyed. Tools, tack, and supplies all gone, Ayanna appeared with bandages and healing salve, helping Lottie tend Caleb's shoulder. The burn wasn't severe, but the impact had done damage. He winced with every movement. "We'll rebuild," Bert said firmly, but worry lined his weathered face. Everyone knew what losing the barn meant: no shelter for stock, no feed for the rest of winter. Even if Caleb's shoulder healed quickly, the ranch's survival hung by a thread. Lottie watched Caleb stare at the smoking ruins, his face drawn with more than physical pain. This attack had struck at the heart of everything he'd built, everything he was trying to protect. But as she stepped closer, he straightened his good shoulder, jaw set with determination. The sun rose fully, glinting off the snow. They had survived the night, but the real fight was just beginning. The morning after the fire dawned bitter cold. Frost crept across the inside of windows, and everyone's breath hung in clouds, even indoors. Caleb stood at what remained of the barn, his left arm bound tight against his chest. The burned timbers still smoldered despite the snow, sending thin wisps of smoke into the pale sky. Bert and Joe had worked through the night to create makeshift shelters for the horses using canvas and spare lumber. The animals huddled beneath these temporary structures, their coats rimmed with frost, steam rising from their backs. Their feed lay in charred heaps among the ruins. "We'll have to cut rations," Caleb said quietly as Lottie brought him a cup of coffee. His good hand shook slightly as he took it, whether from cold or pain she couldn't tell. For everyone, not just the stock. Inside the house, Ayanna portioned out breakfast, half the usual serving of beans and cornbread for each person. Who watched with solemn eyes as the adults ate their meager meals. No one complained, but worry hung heavy in the air. Caleb tried to help with the morning chores, but every movement brought a grimace to his face. The burned shoulder was bad enough, but the impact had done worse damage beneath. When he dropped a bucket, unable to grip with his injured arm, frustration flashed across his features. Lottie watched him struggle, her heart aching. The ranch had become her home, these people, her family. She couldn't bear to see it all slip away. While the others worked outside, she went to her room and pulled on her warmest clothes. Layer by layer, the sleigh sat behind the house, rarely used. Lottie hitched up the steadiest horse they had left, her fingers clumsy with cold but determined. The runners needed cleaning, but they would serve. "What do you think you're doing?" Caleb's voice startled her as she checked the harness one final time. "Someone has to go for help," she said, not meeting his eyes. "You can't, not with that shoulder. The others are needed here." She squared her shoulders. "I'm going to Henry's forge." "Storm's coming." Caleb nodded, toward the western sky, where dark clouds gathered. "Then I'd best hurry." At him directly? "We can't survive this alone, Caleb. We need friends." He studied her face for a long moment, then pulled off his mittens. His mother's knitting, worn but warm. "Take these at least. Your hands will freeze in those thin gloves." The mittens engulfed her hands, still carrying the warmth of his skin. Something caught in her throat as she nodded her thanks. The sleigh moved easily over the packed snowbells, jingling in the frigid air. Lottie kept the horse at a steady pace, watching the clouds build behind her. The wind picked up as she approached the settlement where Henry's forge stood. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the rhythmic ring of hammer on anvil guided her the final distance. The beating stopped as she drew near. Mary emerged, his broad face creased with concern. "Child, what brings you out in this weather?" He helped her down from the sleigh, noting her shivering despite the layers. Inside the forge, blessed warmth seeped into her frozen fingers as she told him everything. The fire, Caleb's injury, the dwindling supplies. The railroad's behind. She finished. "They're trying to drive us out before spring." Henry's expression darkened. "Us. Burning a man's barn in winter, that's not business. That's murder." He stoked the forge's fire, sparks dancing upward. "My people know something? About being driven from our homes? We won't stand by and watch it happen to friends. Can you help us?" Lottie's voice cracked slightly. "Labor protection, all of those," Henry said firmly. "I'll speak to the band council tonight." There are others in town, too, who won't stomach such methods. Give us 2 days to gather what's needed. The storm was breaking as Lottie started home, fat snowflakes swirling around the sleigh. The horse plowed steadily through deepening drifts. Even with Caleb's mittens, her fingers grew numb on the reins. The wind cut through every layer of clothing, and darkness fell early under the heavy clouds. Lantern light guided her the final distance home. Caleb stood on the porch, his good hand gripping the railing. The relief on his face made her throat tight again. "Wasn't sure you'd beat the storm," he said, helping her down with his one good arm. "Come get warm." Inside, she couldn't stop shaking, the cold seemingly lodged in her bones. Caleb built up the fire, while Ayanna made her drink something hot. An herbal, slowly. Feeling returned to her fingers and toes, bringing painful tingles. "Henry will help," she told them through chattering teeth. "He's calling a council meeting tonight. Said to give him 2 days to organize people, both Ute and townfolk." "You did good," Caleb said softly. The firelight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, reminding her of starlight on snow. "Real good." Later, when the others had gone to bed, they sat together by the fire. The storm howled outside, but in here was warmth and something that felt like peace, despite everything. Despite everything. "Reminds me of a winter when I was young," Caleb said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Worst one anyone could remember. Food was scarce. Wolves were bold. My father had passed the year before." He paused, feeding another log to the flames. "Most folks thought my mother should sell the ranch, move to town," said a woman couldn't manage alone. Lottie pulled her feet up under her skirts, drawing closer to both fire and story. "What did she do?" "Prove them wrong." A smile touched his lips. "Worked harder than any man I've ever known. Taught me everything: how to track game in snow, preserve meat, repair tack. How to survive." His good hand traced patterns on the arm of his chair. "But mostly she taught me about strength, the quiet kind that keeps going when everything says quit." He looked at Lottie then, something warm in his eyes. "Saw that same kind of strength today, watching you drive off into that storm." Lottie ducked, her head feeling heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the flames dance while the wind sang winter's song outside. Despite the uncertainty hanging over them, despite the cold and hunger and fear, something bloomed in Lottie's heart, a warmth deeper than any fire could provide, a feeling of finally truly belonging. Dawn broke cold and clear over the snow-covered valley. The crunch of wagon wheels on frozen ground drew everyone to the windows. Through the crystalline morning air, a procession approached 3 heavily laden wagons from town, followed by smaller sleds from the Ute settlement. Caleb stepped onto the porch, his good hand shading his eyes against the brilliant snow glare. "Looks like Henry kept his word," he said softly as Lottie joined him. The lead wagon carried rough-cut timber, the fresh wood pale against the weathered sides of the vehicle. Behind it came hay and feed, precious as gold in the deep of winter. Wagon bore blankets, tools, and other supplies. The Ute sleds brought dried meat, winter vegetables, and more timber. Men and women climbed down, stamping their feet against the cold. Henry emerged from the group, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "Thought you could use some neighborly help," he called out, grinning. Ayanna took charge of the kitchen immediately, organizing the women who had come to help. Soon, the smell of coffee and frying cornbread filled the house. She moved with quiet efficiency, directing helpers to keep the workers fed throughout the day. Water's running low, Lottie noticed, grabbing 2 buckets. The well wasn't far, but the path had to be rebroken through deep snow after each storm. She made trip after trip, her cheeks growing rosy with exertion and pride. Each time she returned, the scene before her had transformed a little more. The burned barn's remains were quickly cleared away. Men worked in teams, following Caleb's directions as he supervised the raising of the new structure. His injured shoulder prevented him from lifting, but his eye for construction proved invaluable. Every beam had to be placed just so, every joint secured against the prairie winds. "Bit higher on the west end," he called out. "That's where the spring storms hit hardest." By midday, the basic framework stood outlined against the blue winter sky. Workers paused only long enough to warm themselves with coffee and bowls of the Thick soup Ayana kept simmering on the stove. Lottie passed among the groups with a coffee pot, refilling cups. She overheard snippets of conversation, townspeople and ute workers sharing stories, trading jokes, working together as if they'd done so all their lives. The railroad's attempt to divide them seemed to have brought them closer instead. As afternoon, shadows lengthened across the snow, Henry disappeared into his sled. He emerged carrying an old trunk, its leather straps cracked with age. "Caleb," he called, "need to show you something." They gathered in the kitchen, Caleb, Henry, and Lottie. Henry's fingers, strong from years at the forge, carefully opened the trunk. He withdrew a leather folder, its surface dark with years of handling. "Been keeping these safe," he said, "since the last treaty negotiations. Marriage records, birth records, important things." His hands moved carefully through the papers until he found what he sought. Here, the document was yellowed but clearly legible. Caleb leaned forward, his good hand steadying himself against the table as he read. Lottie watched his face, saw the moment understanding dawned. "My mother," he whispered. Henry nodded, effute through her mother's line. "Never talked about it much. Those were hard times for mixed families. But she made sure everything was properly recorded." Caleb sank into a chair, still staring at the document. "I knew she had some native blood. She spoke a little Ute, knew the old ways. But I never knew she was protecting you," Henry said gently, "waiting until you were ready to understand. But she made sure the proof was there when you needed it." The kitchen grew quiet except for the snap of the stove fire. Outside, hammers continued their rhythm against the winter air. Lottie wanted to reach out, touch Caleb's shoulder, but held back. Sensing he needed space to absorb this revelation, Henry pulled his pipe from his coat pocket, packed it carefully. "Your blood ties mean this land is yours," he said, striking a match. "If you'll claim it." Caleb looked up from the document, his eyes distant for a moment before focusing on Henry's face. Slowly he nodded. The weight that had bowed his shoulders these past weeks seemed to lift slightly. "I'll claim it," he said firmly. "For my mother's sake, and for everyone who's helped us stand against the railroad's tricks." A shout from outside drew their attention. The last beam of the barn's basic structure was being raised. They moved to the window to watch. The new barn skeleton rose straight and true against the darkening sky, a testament to what people could build when they worked together. Lottie slipped out to fetch more water, her heart lighter than it had been in days. The snow crunched beneath her boots, and her breath rose in clouds, but she barely felt the cold. As she worked the well pump, she looked back at the house. Light spilled from its windows, warm and welcoming. Shadows moved inside, Henry and Caleb still talking, Ayana directing her helpers, workers coming in to warm themselves. Home, she thought. It's not just for her anymore, but for all of them. A place where people came together, where the bonds of friendship proved stronger than greed or prejudice. She lifted her filled buckets and turned back toward the house. Her steps sure, despite the slippery path. The sun was setting by the time the day's work ended. The new barn stood half completed, ready for the rest of the work tomorrow. Workers departed slowly, promising to return at dawn. Soon only the usual household remained, plus Henry, who had been invited to stay the night. After supper, they gathered by the fire. Henry and Caleb sat with coffee cups in hand, their conversation soft but hopeful. The marriage record lay on the table between them, proof against any legal challenge the railroad might bring. Lottie sat nearby, mending tears in work gloves. By the firelight, her heart full of quiet joy, morning sunlight glinted off the fresh snow as Caleb hitched the horses to the wagon. His shoulders still ached, but the work had to be done. He checked each strap carefully, making sure everything was secure for the long ride to the county seat. The tin box containing the precious document sat wrapped in oilcloth on the kitchen table, waiting. Lottie emerged from the house wearing her best dress, faded but clean, carefully pressed the night before. In her arms, she carried the tin box, like it held pure gold. Perhaps it did, in its own way. She had polished the box until it shone, determined that everything should look proper for the judge. Ready? Caleb asked, offering his good arm to help her up onto the wagon seat. She nodded, clutching the box close. I checked inside 3 times this morning. The document's safe. Caleb clucked to the horses and they moved out. Behind them, Henry and Ayanna stood on the porch with young Tahu. The boy waved until the wagon disappeared around the bend in the road. The journey to the county seat took most of the morning. The horses' hooves crunched through crusty snow, their breath streaming in the cold air. Lottie kept the box on her lap, one hand always touching it. Sometimes she glanced at Caleb, noting how straight he sat despite his injury, how determined. His profile looked against the winter sky. The courthouse rose before them, past Nuna 2-story brick building with white trim, its windows gleaming in the sun. Caleb helped Lottie down from the wagon, then tied the horses to the hitching post. They climbed the courthouse steps together, their boots leaving snowy prints on the wooden stairs inside. The air was warm and smelled of wood polish and old paper. Their footsteps echoed on the polished floor as they approached the clerk's desk. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up expectantly. "We need to see Judge Harrison," Caleb said. "It's about a land dispute with the railroad." The clerk disappeared into the judge's chambers. Moments later, he ushered them in. Judge Harrison sat behind a massive oak desk, his gray hair neatly combed, his expression neutral but attentive. "Mr. Holt," he said, gesturing to the chairs before his desk. "What brings you here today?" Lottie carefully placed the tin box on the desk. Caleb opened it and withdrew the marriage record, handling it with reverence. "Sir, I have proof of my mother's Ute heritage. According to the treaty, this gives me legal claim to my ranch land." The judge took the document, studying it through his reading glasses. His fingers traced the dates, the names, the official seals. Minutes ticked by on the large clock on the wall. Finally, he looked up. "This appears genuine," he said slowly. "But given the railroad's interest in this matter, we'll need to hold a proper hearing. Can you return tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock? "Yes, sir," Caleb replied. "Bring any witnesses who can speak to your claim," the judge added, "and to any incidents involving the railroad's representatives." Lottie stepped forward, her voice steady, despite her racing heart. "I can testify, Your Honor. I've seen how they've tried to force us off the land." Judge Harrison looked at her thoughtfully, then nodded. "Very well, Miss Ransom," she supplied. "Lottie Ransom, Miss Ransom. Tomorrow at 9 o'clock, then?"
Outside.
The courthouse, the afternoon sun, had begun its early winter descent. Caleb led the way to the town's small boarding house, a neat white building with green shutters and a wraparound porch.
8.
The proprietor, Mrs. Weber, showed them to their rooms. Caleb upstairs at the front of the house, Lottie in a smaller room. At the back, "Supper's at 6 sharp," Mrs. Weber told them, her keys jingling at her waist as she walked away. Lottie unpacked her small carpet bag, hanging her spare dress carefully to remove the wrinkles. The room was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small mirror. She stood before it, studying her reflection. The girl who had once been auctioned off in Dry Creek seemed like a stranger now. At 6 o'clock, they gathered with the other boarders in the dining room. Mrs. Weber served a hearty meal of beef stew, fresh bread and apple pie. As they ate, Caleb leaned close to Lottie. "You don't have to testify tomorrow if you're afraid," he said quietly. "I know facing them won't be easy." Lottie set down her fork, meeting his concerned gaze. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said firmly. "That ranch is home now, our home. I want to help protect it." The conviction in her voice made Caleb sit back, a look of pride crossing his face. Around them, the other boarders chatted about local matters, but Lottie barely heard them. Her mind was already on tomorrow, on the words she would speak to the judge. After supper, they sat in the boarding house parlor. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the braided rug. Lottie took out her mending. There was always something that needed fixing while Caleb read through the treaty document. One more time, committing every word to memory, the grandfather clock in the corner struck 8, then 9. Other boarders drifted up to their rooms. Finally, Caleb folded the document carefully and returned it to its tin box. We should get some rest, he said, rising from his chair. Tomorrow's an important day. Lottie gathered her mending. At the foot of the stairs, they paused. Thank you, she said softly, for letting me help. Thank you for being brave enough to stand with me, he replied. They climbed to their separate rooms, their footsteps quiet on the carpeted stairs. In her room, Lottie changed into her nightgown and knelt beside the bed to pray. But tonight, instead of asking forgiveness for being ugly and useless, she asked for strength to speak truth tomorrow, through her window. She could see the courthouse, its brick walls pale in the moonlight. Tomorrow, they would face the railroad men, defend their home, stand together against those who would take what wasn't theirs to take. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. The county courthouse filled quickly that morning. By 9 o'clock, every wooden bench was packed with townsfolk, railroad men, and members of the Ute tribe. Whispers echoed off the high ceiling as Judge Harrison took his seat, his black robes rustling as he settled behind the bench. Caleb sat at the front table, his injured shoulder held stiffly. Beside him, Lottie smoothed her dress with trembling hands. The railroad's lawyer, Mitchell Blackwood, occupied the other table, his suit pressed and his mustache perfectly waxed. Court is now in session, the clerk announced, his voice carrying. Through the crowded room, Blackwood rose first, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease. Your Honor, the railroad's position is clear. This land is essential for progress. A water stop at this location would serve thousands of passengers, bringing prosperity to this entire region. He gestured expansively. Mr. Holt's small ranch cannot outweigh the needs of so many.
Outdid.
Judge Harrison listened, his expression neutral. When Blackwood finished, he nodded to Caleb. Mr. Holt, you may present your case. Caleb stood carefully, mindful of his shoulder. He lifted the marriage record from the tin box. Your Honor, this document proves my mother's Ute heritage, according to the treaty that gives me legal right to this land. He handed the paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. I call Henry Tall Elk, Caleb said, his voice steady. Henry approached the front, his boots clicking on the wooden floor. He raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth, then settled into the witness chair. How long did you know Sarah Holt? Caleb asked. I knew Caleb's mother all her life, Henry replied. Her Ute name was Morning Star. She was the daughter of Swift River, my father's cousin. The marriage record shows her union with James Holt, but we all knew her as one of our own. Blackwood cross-examined Henry sharply, but couldn't shake his testimony. When Henry stepped down, Caleb called Lottie's name. She rose slowly, her heart pounding. The wooden gate to the witness stand creaked as she passed through it. After taking the oath, she sat, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. Miss Ransom, Caleb said gently, please tell the court what you witnessed at the ranch. Lottie's voice quavered at first. The railroad man, Mr. Grayson, came to the ranch. He offered Caleb $2,000 to leave. She swallowed hard, then continued stronger. When Caleb refused, Mr. Grayson said the railroad always gets what it wants. The gallery murmured. Judge Harrison tapped his gavel once. Then my father came, Lottie went on, her chin lifting. He tried to make me leave, to weaken Caleb's position. 4 days later, ... her voice caught. 4 days later, the barn burned. All our winter feed was lost. The beam that fell on Caleb's shoulder could have killed him. The murmurs grew louder. Lockwood stood to object, but Lottie wasn't finished. That ranch isn't just about progress or profit, she said, her voice ringing. Clear now. It's about home and family and doing what's right. Caleb took me in when I had nothing. He showed me kindness when others showed only cruelty. That land is his by law and by right. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but her gaze remained steady. In the gallery, several women dabbed at their eyes. Even some of the railroad men looked uncomfortable. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess. The waiting seemed endless, but finally he returned, settling his robes around him with deliberate care. Having reviewed the evidence and heard testimony, I find that Caleb Holt's claim to the land is valid under the terms of the treaty. The railroad's petition is denied. This court stands adjourned. The crack of the gavel was almost lost in the eruption of cheers. People surged forward to shake Caleb's hand. Henry's deep laugh boomed out as he clapped Caleb on his good shoulder. Ute elders nodded approval, while townspeople who had once looked askance at Lottie now smiled warmly, outside on the courthouse steps. Winter sunlight sparkled on fresh snow. Lottie stood beside Caleb, her cheeks wet with joyful tears as more well-wishers gathered around them. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, truly valued. She had helped save their home. She belonged. 2 days after the courthouse victory, Caleb guided the wagon down the snow-packed road toward home. Lottie sat beside him, wrapped in a thick blanket against the morning chill. The familiar silhouette of the ranch peered through. The winter haze, the weathered house, the corrals, and there, standing proud against the gray sky, the new barn. As they drew closer, Lottie caught the rich scent of fresh-cut pine. The wagon wheels crunched through the snow as they pulled up to the barn's wide doors. Inside, everything gleamed with newness. Sturdy support beams stretched overhead. Neat stalls lined the walls, and along the back, feed sacks were stacked. In orderly rows reaching nearly to the roof, asterisk neighbors had gathered to welcome them home. Henry Tall Elk stood with his smithing hammer hanging from his belt. Several Ute families who had helped with the rebuilding clustered near the door, children peeking shyly around their parents' legs. Even some of the townsfolk who had once turned away from Lottie now offered warm smiles. Caleb moved through the crowd slowly, taking time with each person. From a wooden chest in the wagon, he withdrew carefully wrapped packages. For Henry, there was a fine leather vest that Caleb had commissioned months ago. To the Ute families, he presented packages of coffee and sugar. Oh, da. The town families received jars of honey and preserves that Lottie had helped put up in the fall. Much obliged. Caleb said to each one, his voice rough with emotion. This means more than I can say. More than I can say. The visitors gradually departed as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow. Bert and Joe led the horses into their fresh-smelling stalls, while Ayanna and Tahu helped unpack the wagon. The familiar sounds of ranch life resumed. The creak of leather, the soft nickering of horses, the thump of boots on wooden floors. As evening approached, fat snowflakes began drifting down from heavy clouds. Lamps were lit inside the house, their warm glow spilling onto the gathering darkness. Caleb found Lottie in the kitchen, helping Ayanna prepare supper. "Miss Lottie," he said quietly, "might I have a word?" She followed him into the front room, where lamplight cast dancing shadows on the walls. Caleb settled into his chair by the fire, gesturing for her to take the other seat. For a moment, he studied the flames, gathering his thoughts. "These past months haven't been easy," he began, "but you've shown more courage than folks twice your age. You've made this place better by being here." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Now that the railroad business is settled, you have a choice to make. If you want to go back to town, start fresh somewhere else, I'll see you're set up proper. Or ... His voice softened. "Or you could stay here, legal and proper, as my adopted daughter." Tears welled in her eyes. But these were different from the frightened tears she'd shed that first night on the auction block. These came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that had been healing slowly all these months. "I'm home," she whispered, her voice breaking into a sob. "If you'll have me, I'm home." Caleb's own eyes grew damp as he reached out to clasp her hand. In the doorway, Ayanna stood watching, one arm around Tahu's shoulders. A gentle smile touched her face as she witnessed this moment of healing, of family being forged stronger than blood. The house seemed to glow from within as snow continued falling outside. Where once there had been emptiness and echo, now there was warmth and life. Caleb looked around at these people who had become his family, Lottie wiping happy tears from her cheeks, Ayanna's quiet strength, Tahu's bright curiosity. The ranch had never felt more alive, more like the home his mother had always wanted it to be. The final Sunday of the year dawned bright and cold. Sunlight sparkling on fresh snow. Inside the ranch house, warmth radiated from the cooking fires as delicious aromas filled every corner. The long wooden table, usually meant for 6, had been stretched with extra boards to welcome nearly 20 guests. Lottie moved through the kitchen with newfound grace, helping Ayanna arrange steaming dishes of venison stew, cornbread, and roasted root vegetables. Her cheeks were flushed from the heat of the stove, but her eyes shone with quiet joy. Through the windows, she could see more sleighs arriving, bells jingling as Ute families and townsfolk made their way up the snow-packed drive. Henry, tall elk, stomped snow from his boots on the porch before entering, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle of fresh-baked bread from his wife. Bert Hanley helped him shed his heavy coat, the two men already deep in conversation about spring planning. Their laughter carried through the house, mixing with the chatter of children and the clatter of plates being set out. When everyone had gathered, they crowded around the table, ranch hands and merchants. Ute, elders, and settler families, all shoulder to shoulder. Caleb nodded to Lottie, and she rose to her feet. The room fell silent as she closed her eyes, clasped her hands, and began to speak. Dear Lord, her voice rang clear and steady, so different from the timid whisper of months ago. We thank you for this food, for this home, and for the peace you've granted us. Thank you for bringing us together as family, though we started as strangers. Bless this meal and all gathered here. Amen. A chorus of amens followed as people began passing dishes. Through the windows, snow drifted lazily past, coating the new barn in another layer of white. The wind sang softly through the pines, carrying away the last echoes of old hurts and fears. Caleb watched from his place at the head of the table as Henry shared a joke with Bert. Their friendship deepened by shared labor. Ayanna moved gracefully between guests, making sure everyone's bowl stayed full. Tohu sat between two town children, all three giggling over some private jest. The ranch house glowed with lamplight and life, so different from the lonely place it had been just months before. These bonds, forged in hardship and strengthened by mercy, had transformed his land into something sacred. Looking at the faces around his table, every one of them family now, in all the ways that mattered, Caleb knew that whatever storms might come, they would weather them together. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.